Dennis Maynard wasn't the kind of man who left things undone. He was methodical, almost to a fault. 41 years old, weathered by a life spent on the Pacific, he knew the waters off Newport better than most. Locals would say he could read the tides like a book and predict fog faster than any app could. So when his pickup truck was found idling in its usual parking spot at Dock 12, untouched since the night before, the quiet that followed wasn't just worry, it was confusion. It was January 14th, 2014. Cold, overcast, low visibility. Dennis had told his sister he planned to go out for halibut solo, just for a few hours, maybe until midnight. A short run, nothing unusual. But when the harbor master did morning rounds and noticed the Lark never returned to its slip, things began to feel off. The coffee in Dennis's travel mug, still sitting on the dock's edge, was ice cold. The Coast Guard was notified by noon. By 2 p.m., helicopters were already combing the coastline. They scouted his usual routes, using archived GPS logs from previous trips. Sea conditions had been calm, no gale warnings, no signs of a rogue swell. The radar station had logged no mayday, no radio distress. It was as if Dennis had been swallowed whole by a flat sea. But that didn't make sense. Not to his family, not to the old-timers who'd shared waters with him for decades. The Lark was a sturdy boat. Restored fiberglass hull, dual engines, well-maintained. He'd done the last round of work himself, just before Christmas. Replaced the depth finder, cleaned the bilge, ran diagnostics on the generator. He even posted a photo of the new anchor winch on a local fishing forum 3 days before he vanished. What rattled everyone the most was the absence of clues. Not a scrap of debris, not a floating cooler or drifting net, not even an oil sheen on the surface. The ocean, normally quick to surrender fragments of shipwrecks or accidents, gave back nothing. His sister, Erica, walked the harbor that evening for hours, scanning the horizon, waiting for the sound of Dennis's engine, a sound she could pick out from a mile away. She never heard it. Security footage from the marina was pulled that night. The cameras showed Dennis arriving at 9:46 p.m. He loaded a small crate onto the boat, climbed aboard, and disappeared into the cabin. Then, at exactly 10:17 p.m., the footage stops. Not just one camera, but all feeds from the dock's surveillance system blinked out for a span of 24 minutes. They came back online at 10:41 p.m. No sign of Dennis, no sign of the Lark. Just still water and empty moorings. The outage was dismissed as a technical glitch, but no one could explain why it had never happened before or since. An electrician inspected the surveillance hub. No signs of tampering, no weather interference, no power surge. It just stopped recording at the precise moment Dennis was preparing to depart and resumed just after he should have been well out to sea. Some believed it was coincidence, others didn't. Over the following days, local fishermen joined search efforts. Dozens of vessels fanned out across the harbor, mouth and beyond. Sonar sweeps were run. Planes traced the coastal currents. They found driftwood, floating buoys, even a dolphin carcass. But nothing tied to the Lark. Dennis's ex-wife Rachel flew in from Bend with their teenage son Owen, hoping to offer comfort to a family that had no answers, no body to bury, and no closure. When asked by reporters if she thought Dennis could have taken his own life, she shook her head slowly and said, "Dennis wouldn't do that. Not to his boy. Not like this." Still, people whispered, maybe he sailed too far out and got caught in something unforgiving. Maybe he misjudged the fog and clipped a reef. Or maybe he just wanted to vanish, escape the monotony, the debt, the grind of a life too quiet to scream for help. But those who knew Dennis didn't buy it. He was reliable. He was tired sometimes, sure, but never defeated, never reckless, never secretive. He had booked a maintenance appointment for his boat the following week and had plans to take Owen camping in spring. By the end of the second week, search efforts scaled down. The Coast Guard issued an official statement classifying the disappearance as a presumed maritime accident. The case was moved to inactive status. A memorial buoy was placed near the harbor mouth, bobbing quietly under gray skies. But beneath the surface, both literal and emotional, something didn't sit right. The ocean was quiet, too quiet. And the Lark, like its captain, had vanished without leaving a single ripple. Dennis Maynard had lived in Newport for nearly 20 years, and in that time, He had become part of the rhythm of the place, like the tides, like the gulls circling the pier. He wasn't loud or overly social, but he showed up. Every morning around 6:15, he'd get coffee from the same gas station on 3rd Street, always black, always in a reusable thermos. He stopped by the harbor office to check tide charts, rain or shine, even on days he wasn't planning to fish. People in town didn't describe him with flourishes. They said things like solid, honest, clockwork. And in a community built around weather-worn hands and boats that don't forgive mistakes, those words carried weight. Which is why, when Dennis vanished, the phrase, "something's wrong," started passing from person to person like a current no one could see but everyone could feel. His sister, Erica, sat down with detectives 2 days after the disappearance. She brought a manila folder packed with documents, bank statements, boat insurance, an unopened Amazon package addressed to Dennis that contained a new fish finder. She told them he'd been planning to take Owen, his 15-year-old grandson, out to sea for the first time in the spring. He'd even started drafting a basic navigation log for him, handwritten on yellow legal paper. He was preparing, she said quietly. That's what Dennis did. He planned things out. Detectives followed the trail of normalcy. His phone records showed routine calls, weekly check-ins with Erica, monthly payments for boat maintenance, a recent call to his propane supplier. He had no history of depression or mental illness. His bills were paid on time, including a quarterly payment made just hours before he left for the marina that night. There were no flagged withdrawals, no suspicious purchases, no burner phones. He hadn't cleaned out his accounts. In fact, he had recently transferred money into savings. And his computer showed he had bookmarked new outboard motor models, researching upgrades, not exits. They met with Rachel, his ex-wife, at a small diner off the 101. Though they hadn't spoken regularly since the divorce, she agreed to talk. She didn't believe Dennis had enemies. He was quiet, kept to himself. But if someone's in trouble, he's the first to pull over. You don't fake that for 20 years. She also mentioned something odd. About a month earlier, Dennis had called her out of the blue. Not to talk about Owen, not about anything in particular, just to say he was thinking of her. It was short, awkward, but it felt final. His fishing buddies were next, the dock workers who'd shared beer with him after long hauls, the ones who knew his boat better than his family did. They painted a consistent picture. Dennis followed a pattern. Check the barometric pressure, review the currents, double-check engine oil, then head southwest to the jetty where he'd had luck for years. But his logbook, recovered from his garage, showed a change. The last entry, dated the morning before he vanished, listed a different location. North by northeast, boundary 47, small reef edge, a spot known to be quieter, less trafficked, and deeper. He hadn't told anyone about it. To the investigators, that detail, seemingly small, stood out. Why switch locations so abruptly, and why keep it to himself? Was he chasing a better haul, testing something, or meeting someone? The problem was, the logbook entry wasn't enough to confirm any of that. It simply hinted. And with no GPS ping from the Lark, the new coordinates were just ink on a page. But in a case with no debris, no body, and no motive, ink can start to look like a roadmap. Erica, after hearing about the route change, admitted she had sensed something shifting in Dennis those last few weeks. Not depression exactly, more like distance. Like he was carrying something he hadn't told anyone, she said, like a decision. But then she shook her head and added, "That's not him. He wouldn't just leave, not without saying goodbye." The deeper they looked, the tighter the loops became. No evidence of planning a disappearance, no financial trail, no emotional unraveling. But there was intent. He chose a new spot. He left no record of it with anyone else. And just days earlier, he'd received a package with new rigging tools, tools he never even opened. Whatever he was doing that night, it wasn't a farewell. It was preparation for something. Something he didn't want to talk about or couldn't. And as investigators stared at the logbook, the word boundary circled in red on the final page, they were left with a gnawing realization. Dennis hadn't run. He had planned to return. He just didn't. The waters off Newport that night were still, eerily so. No wind warnings, no choppy waves, no forecasted squalls. Just a blanket of low fog and the muffled churn of diesel motors in the distance. According to the harbor master's log, 7 boats had left the docks between 8 p.m. and midnight. 6 came back. The only one unaccounted for was the Lark. That detail, in and of itself, wasn't alarming at first. Boats occasionally stayed out past check-in, especially when the haul was promising. But by sunrise, when the tide had turned and Dennis hadn't returned, alarm gave way to procedure. The harbor patrol confirmed it quickly. There was no radar record of the Lark crossing the outer breakwater. That line, invisible to most, marked the last digital tether between the vessel and land. Every boat that passed it pinged the system, an automated handshake. Dennis's boat never registered. Either he never left the harbor or he disappeared inside it. That possibility was hard to fathom. This wasn't a sprawling commercial port. It was a small fishing harbor. Every slip, every buoy, every rusting ladder was mapped, measured, and watched. Boats don't just vanish from still water. By noon, the Coast Guard was involved. The official search launched from both water and air. They began with sonar sweeps, dragging arrays from trawlers across the inlet and along the outer reefs. Search grids were mapped out from Yaquina Head north to Cape Lookout. Helicopters scouted the sea surface for anything. An oil trail, shattered wood, floating debris, nothing. No sign of a collision, no emergency beacon, no floating life ring. Dennis's EPIRB, emergency position indicating radio beacon, had never been triggered. A day passed, then another. A private diving team was brought in, funded in part by local donations. Fishermen who had once tied knots beside Dennis now scanned the bottom of the bay in pairs. They found rusted crab traps, broken propellers, and discarded netting, but nothing that pointed to the Lark. A camera was lowered into deeper shelf regions. All it picked up were sand channels and the distant shimmer of fish. At the marina, theories started growing in the silence. Some believed it was a rogue wave, an unpredictable swell that could capsize a boat without warning, but that didn't fit. There was no storm. Other whispers leaned darker. Smuggling. Maybe Dennis saw something he shouldn't have. Maybe he was involved, but no one who knew him believed that. His record was clean. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't carry debt. He lived alone, modestly, and worked by the book. There was talk of suicide, that maybe something in Dennis had quietly broken. But the people closest to him pushed back. He had just renewed his fishing permit. He'd ordered replacement parts for his fuel injectors. He'd started putting aside money for a trip with his grandson. None of it added up. And besides, if it was intentional, where was the wreckage? The sea, in most cases, gives something back. By the end of the first week, the Coast Guard scaled down their official search. Weather had turned, pushing back further dives. The case was classified as a maritime disappearance under unknown circumstances. But those who lived along the docks, those who knew how the water moved, didn't accept it. They'd lost people before, capsized boats, ice-cold drownings, but they always found something, a cooler, a life vest, an engine cowl washed up on the beach days later. Dennis had left nothing behind. The harbor, normally a place of sound, of clanking masts, barking gulls, and boat engines starting at dawn, had grown quieter. Every creak of a rope in the wind became a question. Had Dennis never launched at all? Had something happened to him before he even left the dock? Or worse, had someone else launched with him? When investigators reviewed the last-minute fuel records, they found that Dennis hadn't topped off his tanks, strange for a man who was meticulous. His boat had enough fuel to reach the deeper shelf and return, but not much more. Why wouldn't he fill up unless he didn't expect to go far, or unless he wasn't the one who planned to bring the boat back at all? In the absence of proof, people created their own explanations, theories stacked up in small-town bars and bait shops. Some believed Dennis faked it all and disappeared. Others blamed foul play. Some said the ocean took him. But those who had worked beside him day after day couldn't shake one thing. The Lark had never made it past the harbor's mouth. And if the boat didn't leave, then maybe the answer never left the docks either. The search had gone silent above the water, but on land, investigators were tightening their grip around the last hour. Anyone knew Dennis Maynard was alive. They couldn't rely on radar or GPS. The Lark had never pinged the outer channel. So they turned to the one tool that might bring the timeline into focus: cameras. Every dockside business had them, angled over gangways, slip gates, even dumpsters. The marina surveillance feed may have failed, but the surrounding properties hadn't. If Dennis had been near any of them, he would have been caught on tape. And he was. The footage was pieced together hour by hour, like fragments of memory. At 10:11 p.m., Dennis is seen pulling into the marina lot. He parks, exits his truck, and pulls a small rolling cart from the bed. Standard gear: bait box, thermos, rain shell. He nods to someone off-frame, walks steadily toward Dock 12, and disappears from view. At 10:16 p.m., a camera above Olson's bait shop catches a wide angle. Dennis walks alone down the ramp toward his boat, head down, both hands on the cart handle. He does not appear to speak to anyone. He does not pause. At 10:17 p.m., the camera at the marina entrance, which should have shown the Lark mooring, goes dark. Not flickering, not freezing, just black. It stays that way until 10:41 p.m., when it comes back online without interference. The marina's electrical team was called in immediately. They ran diagnostics on the surveillance hub, checked wiring panels, and reviewed maintenance logs. No failures were found. There were no surges, no outages in the city grid, no local maintenance scheduled. Even more strange, the outage only affected the dock cameras, nothing else. The bait freezer and payment systems operated normally. The outage was clean, specific, and silent, almost too perfect. That anomaly shifted the investigation's tone. What had been a presumed maritime accident was beginning to feel curated, as if someone had known exactly when and where to cut visibility. But that begged the larger question: who and why? Investigators returned to the fueling station records, trying to determine if Dennis had topped up prior to launching. He hadn't. The last recorded fuel purchase was logged under a different slip number entirely. But the night shift worker, a 19-year-old named Tyler Ross, offered something unexpected. He remembered seeing Dennis that night, said he waved from a distance, but then he paused and added, "I think there was someone else, like 20, 30 feet behind him, another guy, didn't get a good look. Hoodie, maybe." The lead cracked something open. Until now, every account had Dennis alone. But if Tyler's memory was right, and someone else had been walking the dock at the same time, unrecorded, undocumented, it changed everything. They pulled the footage again, this time focusing on angles outside the obvious, reflections in windows, overlapping views. At 10:16:34, a frame from Olson's bait shop shows Dennis rolling his cart down the ramp, and in the distant reflection of the glass door across the way, almost invisible, a figure stands near the piling. Too blurry for ID, no face, no clear posture, just stillness. And then, it's gone. Investigators canvassed the area. No one else had signed in to fish that night. No other vessels reported departures after Dennis. Dock logs were clean, but a maintenance closet on the northern walkway, seldom used, was found unlocked. Inside were footprints in dried mud, fresh, mismatched, one boot, one sneaker. Investigators swabbed the area, lifted partial prints, and bagged a discarded cigarette butt left in the corner. Lab results were pending. The possibility that Dennis wasn't alone reopened every earlier theory. Was he meeting someone? Was it a deal gone wrong, a confrontation? Or did he stumble upon something he wasn't meant to see? His ex-wife was interviewed again. She recalled a moment a week before he vanished. Dennis had been on edge, distracted. When she asked him if everything was okay, he just said, "Some folks around here aren't who they used to be," and changed the subject. The phrase stuck with investigators. What did he mean by aren't who they used to be? Was he referring to someone on the dock, a former friend, a new threat? Or was it just a passing comment from a man used to keeping things to himself? They searched his email history, his phone logs. No texts that seemed alarming, no emails out of the ordinary. But in his notes app, buried under receipts and gear lists, was a draft with just one line. If anything happens, it wasn't an accident. With each detail, the picture became less about a man lost to the ocean and more about a timeline surgically erased. Dennis had walked toward his boat alone, but someone may have followed, someone the cameras missed, someone who knew exactly how long they'd have before everything went dark. By the time a full year had passed, Dennis Maynard's name had become part of dockside folklore. A man who vanished so cleanly the sea never gave back so much as a splinter of his boat. His family, resigned to a hollow truth, held a memorial off the coast near the reef, where Dennis had once taught his grandson to fish for rock bass. They scattered flowers into the wind, said quiet things that wouldn't be heard, and dropped a brass weight into the water engraved with his name. Closure wasn't real, but rituals helped keep the pain from metastasizing into obsession. Most believed Dennis had fallen overboard. Maybe a heart attack, maybe a slip, maybe bad luck in a fog too thick to scream through. The ocean had claimed stranger things. The Newport County Sheriff's Department had moved the case to inactive status by then. No new leads, no forensic anomalies, no movement in his bank accounts or identity. They boxed up the evidence, his phone, fishing logs, and the last recovered items from his garage, and locked it all away. It was, by the book, over. But then something strange arrived. A plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from Astoria. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on an old mechanical typewriter. The message was just 12 words. He didn't drown. The boat went down with both of them. There was no name, no detail, no date. The envelope carried no fingerprints, no DNA under the flap. At first, it was dismissed as a prank, the kind of sick letter that sometimes comes after publicized disappearances. But the phrasing unsettled Detective Ray Hollis. Both of them. That implied another person, someone who was never reported missing, someone who was with Dennis that night. It also implied knowledge the public didn't have. Official reports had never mentioned a second person. The detail had been kept quiet, buried in the open gaps between witness statements and missing camera footage. Weeks passed with no follow-up. The letter was logged and shelved. But then a second thread surfaced, this time underwater. Jonah Beck, a contracted sonar technician for a coastal mapping company, was working a freelance job in shallow coastal channels, roughly 10 miles north of Newport. His task was to chart minor shelf shifts and potential erosion paths for a land survey. But during a mid-morning pass across a narrow trench just off Cascade Head, he caught a return signal that gave him pause. The shape wasn't geological. It was angular, hollow, partially buried under silt, with a profile similar to that of a vessel, about 26 feet in length, 12 feet wide, broken midsection. Beck submitted the report to the Department of Natural Resources, but the coordinates caught the attention of a retired diver who moonlighted as a consultant for missing persons cases. He forwarded the data to local authorities, who flagged it against archived searches. The match was unexpected. The trench hadn't been part of the original grid in the Dennis Maynard case. It was too far north, too deep. No current would have carried a disabled vessel that direction. Hollis pulled the file again. He read the letter, read it twice, then reviewed the sonar image Beck had submitted. It was grainy but undeniable. A vessel lay there, partially obscured, with outlines that bore a resemblance to the Lark, but there was no nameplate, no clear registration number in the scan. Still, the hull shape, the length, the alignment, it was enough to warrant a deeper look. They reached out to Beck for clarification. He hadn't touched the site since the scan. He wasn't licensed for salvage or recovery. But he remembered something else. The anomaly had been detected roughly 100 feet off an older crab trap line, one that hadn't been used commercially in years, an unofficial fishing zone, quiet, isolated. The sheriff's office secured a temporary permit for exploration. A new sweep was scheduled. Divers would be needed, specialized equipment. But weather was turning. The window was narrow. If they didn't move soon, the trench could shift, burying the site for good. Erica Maynard was contacted and informed cautiously. They told her only that an anomaly was discovered, that it was preliminary, that it may not be anything at all. But the tone in their voice told her otherwise. She sat with the letter that night, running her thumb over the words until the ink smudged. It hadn't come from nowhere. Someone had known. Someone had written those 12 words as a warning, or maybe a confession, and now the ocean was whispering something back. After a year of silence, of dead channels and cold water, a new current was pulling at the truth. Something was down there. And it wasn't just debris. The ocean had kept its secret for almost 2 years. But in the spring of 2016, a private salvage crew, contracted quietly through the sheriff's office and partially funded by Dennis Maynard's family, lowered their first remotely operated vehicle into the trench off Cascade Head. The currents were unpredictable, visibility poor. But on the third descent, 317 feet below the surface, the shape came into view, skeletal, rust-etched and fractured from pressure and time. The vessel had collapsed inward along its port side, its bow wedged into the slope at an unnatural angle. Barnacles clung to its remaining rail. A cracked propeller blade jutted from silt, and near the upper stern, a faint sequence of paint-stained numbers peeled through the corrosion. It matched the Lark's registration. There was no celebration, only silence. The crew kept their voices low as they monitored the feed. One of the divers, a former Navy man named Cole, said softly, "That boat didn't just go down, it got hit." He wasn't speaking in metaphors. The footage made it clear. This wasn't a storm wreck or a slow rot. There were stress fractures in the starboard engine casing, crushed inward, and splintered fiberglass radiated from a single point near the transom. It looked violent, concentrated, as if something had struck it with precision and force. The cabin, though partially collapsed, was accessible. The ROV's robotic arm pried open the rear hatch with cautious movements. Inside, the light cut through floating silt to reveal a warping interior. Most fixtures eaten away by corrosion, the ceiling panel half caved. But tucked against the far wall, secured under rusted netting, was a box. The ROV carefully retrieved it, a warped plastic tackle box, sealed but cracked. Inside were rusted hooks, 2 faded lures, and a flashlight. Nothing personal, nothing human. But further back, wedged beneath the shattered helm console, the team spotted a dark object folded and waterlogged. The ROV's claw extracted it. A weatherproof logbook, zippered in a pouch. The casing had degraded, but the seal held just enough. When brought to the surface and dried in a pressurized chamber, the outer pages fell apart, but the last section, compact and pressed together, had survived. There were scribbled entries, Dennis's handwriting. Most were standard notes, bait types, water temperature, engine RPM. But several pages had been torn out, and near the end was a smeared entry with a timestamp, 10:51 p.m., just a line and a half visible. The first read, "Keel feels unstable, unfamiliar sound below deck." The next began with, "Could be collision." And then ink, smudge, nothing. There were no human remains, no clothing, no bones, no trace of Dennis Maynard. But divers found a wristwatch lodged between collapsed shelving, a familiar silver dial, cracked face, stuck at 10:53. Erica later confirmed it had belonged to Dennis, a birthday gift from their mother nearly 30 years ago. That was enough for the sheriff's office to file an amended report. Presumed deceased, remains unrecovered, wreckage confirmed. But assumptions didn't match the wreck's story. A calm sea couldn't inflict that kind of trauma. A storm wouldn't strike one specific spot and leave the rest eerily intact. The impact point suggested a ram, possibly another vessel, possibly deliberate. The ROV also recovered scratches along the stern consistent with steel hull contact. This wasn't a fluke. Someone, or something, had made contact with the Lark hard enough to rupture it below the surface. Detective Hollis reviewed the evidence from the salvage team, his brow furrowed over the collision pattern. He'd seen wrecks before, capsizes, groundings, even explosions. This one didn't fit. It was clean, centered, and lacked the chaos of a natural disaster. There were no drag marks, no sand trails, just a cratered dent and a sunken boat buried in silence. What stood out most wasn't just the damage, it was the absence. No emergency flare, no distress call, no evidence Dennis had even tried to escape. It was as if the collision had happened fast, so fast that even a man with decades of sea sense never had time to reach for the radio. And then there was the letter, the cryptic line sent months earlier. He didn't drown. The boat went down with both of them. That phrasing clung to every new finding like seaweed on a propeller. 2 people, a second figure, a crash that wasn't weather-driven, a logbook ripped apart. Dennis's sister stared at the ROV footage for hours that night on a USB drive given to her by the team. The Lark, once a symbol of steady days and honest work, now rested in darkness, crumpled and half swallowed by the trench, and she couldn't stop asking one question that no one could yet answer. If Dennis was with someone, who was the other body meant to be? The logbook was turned over to forensics immediately after recovery. Though waterlogged and warped, portions had been preserved well enough to extract. Each page was carefully dried under vacuum press, treated with chemical stabilizers, and scanned under UV to make faded ink legible. Most entries were what you'd expect from Dennis: straightforward, systematic, coordinates, bait types, tidal shifts, the kind of data a man who'd been at sea most of his life would jot down without thinking. But toward the back, the tone began to shift. The handwriting, normally steady and compact, became looser, rushed. There were ink smudges and heavy pressure on the page, as if the pen had been dragged across wet paper. Then came the final entry. A timestamp. 11:03 p.m., 2 short lines. The first was clear: lights on the water, not alone. The second, half blotted and partially illegible, read, "Don't trust," followed by a water-damaged blur. A name, probably, but now gone forever. The forensic analyst noted pressure grooves where the rest of the line had once been, but even 3D laser scans couldn't reconstruct it. The stroke was too faint, the paper too degraded, but the implication couldn't be missed. It was the most chilling proof yet that Dennis hadn't been alone that night. He'd seen someone, possibly another vessel, possibly a person, and he'd felt the need to record it, to document the moment, not as a routine observation, but as a warning. The way the sentence trailed off, mid-thought, mid-stroke, gave investigators an image they couldn't shake. Dennis in the dark of his cabin, scribbling frantically as something or someone approached. Detective Hollis had the entry printed and pinned to the incident board above a stack of archived harbor records. The phrase, "not alone," now reframed everything. It ruled out an accident. It leaned hard into a second presence. It gave weight to Tyler Ross's earlier account, the dockhand who'd claimed to see a second figure trailing Dennis near the marina that night, and it brought back that letter. The one mailed from Astoria that simply said, "The boat went down with both of them." With a narrowed timeline, Dennis alive as late as 11:03, the team dug into departure records from that night, January 14, 2014. There were 6 boats logged after dark. 5 had returned. The 6th was Dennis. But the system wasn't perfect. Some skippers operated without logging properly. Others left slips they didn't rent. Hollis pulled the CCTV stills again. One in particular caught his eye. 10:45 p.m., a faint light reflected in a storefront window facing the water. The source wasn't the Lark. Her launch light pattern was known. This reflection flickered in a different pattern. Not halogen, more likely LED, mounted higher, possibly a cabin cruiser or a small commercial vessel. The reflection was traced to a side camera from an equipment rental shop. When reviewed at quarter speed, it showed 2 distinct light clusters spaced roughly 20 feet apart, navigational lights, one red, one white, a boat not listed on the logs. Investigators consulted archived slip assignments and found an anomaly. Slip 14 had been marked vacant that night, but a separate system, a billing note from the fuel station, showed an off-record diesel purchase at 9:42 p.m., billed to an unregistered slip, paid in cash. The receipt, still archived, listed the transaction name as CRV Marine, an alias that had appeared once before in a 2010 investigation involving illegal fishing routes and underreported catch weights. That case had named a suspect, Carl Rivenhall, a former trawler captain banned from several commercial operations due to permit violations, known to operate at night, off-record, often in cash. He'd been questioned briefly when Dennis first went missing, but dismissed at the time. No hard connection. Now, his name wasn't just on paper. It echoed through the logbook's final unfinished warning, the partial reflection, the mystery slip, the off-record launch, and the damage to the Lark, impact damage consistent with a collision at close quarters. Rivenhall hadn't been mentioned in years. He'd sold his boat, moved north, and disappeared into off-grid Alaska fishing jobs. But now, with Dennis's final words finally exposed, his name was back on the board. Hollis quietly reopened the inquiry into Rivenhall's activity in January 2014. An old Coast Guard patrol log noted that his vessel, the Orion, had been cited for a lighting violation in the Newport region just days before Dennis disappeared. The logs even included a plate number. The vessel was never seen in that port again after January 15th. No recorded sale, no listed transfer, just a dead trail. Until now. The name in Dennis's logbook may have been lost to salt and water damage, but every clue was beginning to orbit the same point. A second boat, a second man, and a final message scribbled in haste. Don't trust, followed by silence. The lead came from a voice no one expected. A retired marina clerk named Helen Dorsey, 72 years old, who happened to be visiting the sheriff's office on unrelated business, renewing her boater's ID card. While chatting with the receptionist, she overheard a deputy mention the Lark, and her eyes narrowed. She asked if Dennis Maynard's case had been reopened. When told yes, she asked to speak with someone in investigations. Her statement, handwritten in neat cursive, changed everything. She remembered that night, not just because of the fog, but because of the paperwork. Helen had been covering an extra shift due to another employee's illness. Around 9:30 p.m., she recalled a boat requesting emergency dock access, unusual for that late hour. It wasn't the Lark. It was a different vessel, newer, with a dark gray hull and a name stenciled near the stern. Orion. She remembered it because it wasn't on the slip roster. No radio registration, no paperwork, no assigned berth. When she asked the man aboard to file documentation, he brushed her off and said he'd be gone by dawn. Just topping fuel, he muttered, in and out. She made a note of the encounter in her personal logbook, a habit she kept after years of seeing questionable activity on the docks. The book, now faded and brittle with time, still held the words in pencil. Orion, unlogged, Dock 14, refused paperwork, 1:14:14 approx 9:45 p.m. With the logbook as unofficial confirmation, investigators dove into archived marina security reports and shell company registrations. Orion hadn't appeared in the National Vessel Registry since late 2013. But cross-referencing partial hull numbers, Coast Guard citations, and enforcement warnings from smaller harbors finally turned up a connection. Carl Rivenhall. A once-respected trawler captain turned shadow operator, multiple infractions for unreported hauls, suspicion of crossing into restricted waters, and a warning from NOAA for tampering with GPS systems to mask location data. He'd operated for years along the Oregon and Washington coast under various LLCs before vanishing from official records. Rivenhall had avoided major legal trouble by staying mobile. Most of his violations were civil, not criminal. But in 2012, he'd been involved in a dockside altercation in Garibaldi after a dispute over stolen fishing equipment. The incident was quietly settled. After that, his operations became less visible. He filed fewer permits, switched vessels frequently, and stopped using marinas with active security logs. When Dennis vanished, Rivenhall wasn't on anyone's radar, literally or figuratively. Digging deeper, investigators discovered that Rivenhall sold Orion under a different name just 2 months after Dennis's disappearance. The sale was processed through a shell brokerage based in Seattle. The boat was re-registered under the name Bitter Current and purchased by a third-party cash buyer in Ketchikan, Alaska. No hull number had been altered, but the physical stencils were repainted. It was the same vessel, same dimensions, same damage history. The timeline was tight. Dennis vanishes on January 14th. Rivenhall sells his boat in March. By April, he relocates to Craig, Alaska, a fishing town so remote it barely shows up in standard databases. With a court order and federal support, investigators traced Rivenhall to a dock rental in Craig. He was working part-time on a small longliner, living in a trailer tucked behind the local bait shop. When approached, he didn't run. He didn't ask why they were there. According to the agents on site, he seemed to know. His first words were, "Took you long enough." Back in Oregon, Detective Hollis reviewed the notes from the initial disappearance again. Dennis had mentioned lights on the water at 11:03 p.m., a second vessel. Now they had a name, a boat, and a man who had every reason to avoid scrutiny. What they didn't have, yet, was a confession. During questioning, Rivenhall remained calm. Smug, even. He claimed he had never met Dennis Maynard, had never crossed paths, and certainly hadn't been in Newport that night. But when investigators showed him the logbook from Helen Dorsey, the one with his boat's name, time, and dock position, his demeanor shifted. He leaned back, folded his arms, then said, "Can't prove anything with a pencil." But when presented with radar analysis, fuel purchase records, and satellite data placing Orion within 5 nautical miles of the Lark's last suspected location, his silence deepened. He wasn't denying anymore. He was calculating. The case, once adrift, was anchoring itself to a man who had gone to great lengths to disappear, just like the boat he may have sunk. And investigators had a growing sense that what happened that night wasn't spontaneous. It was personal, deliberate, and whatever Dennis had written, "Don't trust," wasn't a vague warning. It was a name he never had time to finish. Carl Rivenhall held out for nearly 8 hours. In the sterile gray interview room of the Ketchikan substation, he sat stone-faced as detectives presented years of quiet evidence stacked like tide-worn stones. Logbooks, sonar images, fuel records, and grainy dock photos. He refused to acknowledge any of it, said he didn't know Dennis Maynard, claimed he wasn't even in Oregon that week. Every question was met with either indifference or disdain. But time has a way of pulling truth from even the most stubborn walls. And eventually, it wasn't the documents or data that cracked him. It was a line written in fading ink, "Don't trust," followed by a smudged blank. When detectives showed Carl a side-by-side comparison of Dennis's handwriting and the recovered logbook, and then laid a sketch from a dockhand beside a decades-old citation photo from Carl's record, he finally exhaled, the kind of breath that comes before something irreversible. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He just leaned back in the chair, rubbed a hand down his weather-beaten face, and said, "He shouldn't have seen it." The story spilled out in fragments. It began with fish, untagged halibut. Carl had been running them off the books for months, selling to a private buyer who didn't ask questions and paid in cash. That night, January 14th, he'd come into Newport under cover of fog, docked without registering, and planned to offload a few crates quickly before heading north. Slip 14 was empty, unmonitored. The usual fueling attendant wasn't there. He thought no one would notice, but Dennis did. Carl hadn't known him well, just in passing. Seen him at marinas, nods exchanged. But as fate would have it, Dennis was loading his own boat that night and spotted Carl's activity. At first, Carl tried to play it off, said he was topping fuel, checking equipment. But Dennis wasn't buying it. He walked closer, saw the open crates, and told Carl he was calling it in. That's when it escalated. Carl claimed the confrontation was verbal at first. Dennis threatened to report him to harbor authorities, said his logs were clean, his permits up to date, and he wouldn't be silent about illegal traffic in his town. Carl panicked. He followed Dennis back down the dock, trying to reason with him. Dennis didn't stop. The argument grew louder, more heated. No one else was around. And then, near the gangway, something changed. "He pushed me," Carl said. "Or maybe I pushed him. I don't know. It happened fast." He described Dennis stumbling backward, hitting the edge of the piling and collapsing. Not unconscious, but dazed. Not bleeding, but not moving right. Carl crouched beside him, shook him, waited for him to respond, but panic had already taken over. He couldn't think clearly, couldn't risk Dennis reporting what he saw. So he made a choice. He dragged Dennis, half-conscious, barely responsive, onto the Lark, tied him to the bench rail with old rope he found in the cabin, started the engine. Towed the vessel behind Orion, just past the mouth of the harbor. He said he planned to dump the evidence, maybe set the boat adrift. But something in him snapped. It was like if the boat disappeared, the problem disappeared. So he turned Orion around, accelerated, and rammed the Lark directly across its port engine housing. Twice, until it cracked. Then he circled away, cut the line, and watched as Dennis's boat tilted, swallowed water, and slowly slipped beneath the surface. Stern first. He claimed he stayed there for nearly an hour, waiting to be sure it went under. When nothing floated back up, he turned off his lights and vanished into the fog. By morning, he was already northbound, and Orion was back under a tarp, repainted within the month. No one had questioned him. The ocean had done its job, until it didn't. When asked why he didn't just leave Dennis on the dock, Carl shrugged. "I thought maybe he'd remember, or maybe he'd die." I didn't know. I panicked. I just needed him gone. There was no triumph in his voice, no real remorse either. Just exhaustion. Like he'd been carrying the weight for years and finally set it down. Back in Newport, Detective Hollis typed the report himself. No dictation, no assistant. He wanted every word correct. The pieces finally fit. The missing dock footage, the sonar signature, the bruised hull, the untagged fish operation, the unfinished warning in Dennis's log. It had all been there, just waiting to be pulled from the tide. Erica was notified by phone. She listened quietly as the detective spoke, then asked only one question. Was he still alive when the boat sank? Hollis didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The autopsy would never be done. The water had taken that option long ago. But inside, he feared the truth. That Dennis Maynard may have been breathing, barely, as the Lark slipped beneath the waves, and the man who could have saved him chose silence. The water that had once swallowed Dennis Maynard now gave him back, not all at once, but piece by piece, bone by bone, truth by slow, unburying truth. With Carl Rivenhall's confession now in writing, and the sonar evidence tying his vessel to the collision pattern, the site off Cascade Head was officially reclassified. Not as a mystery, not as a tragic accident, but as a crime scene. It had taken 9 years to reach that designation, 9 years of theories, false sightings, cold leads, and what-ifs. But now, the divers went back down, not to wonder, but to confirm. The pressure at 300 feet crushed everything it touched. The hull of the Lark, already split by impact, had collapsed further over the years under the weight of silt and time. Still, the ROV team knew where to look. They worked slowly, methodically, brushing away sediment where the bench seat had once been bolted to the starboard side, just as Carl had described. And there, beneath fractured beams and the rotted remains of a nylon net, was what they were searching for. Not the whole skeleton, but enough. A femur, a pelvis, fragments of spine, and 2 molars still lodged in the upper jaw. Tucked inside the rusted remains of a tool compartment nearby was a belt buckle Dennis's sister immediately recognized when the image was shown to her, a silver fishhook design she'd given him for his 40th birthday. It didn't take long for the medical examiner to confirm what everyone already knew. The dental records matched. The bone density and age range were consistent. The recovery was limited. Most of the soft tissue and even portions of the lower body had likely deteriorated or been carried off by deep-sea scavengers. But there was no doubt now. Dennis had been aboard the Lark when it went down, just as the letter had claimed, just as Carl, finally cornered, had admitted. The official press conference was brief. Sheriff Melby stood at the podium, flanked by state officials and Coast Guard personnel. He read the statement with quiet finality. We can now confirm that Dennis Maynard's remains were recovered from the wreckage site and that the vessel was intentionally sunk as part of a cover-up following an altercation on January 14, 2014. The suspect, Carl Rivenhall, has pleaded guilty to manslaughter and other related charges. The case is now closed. Closed. That word hit different depending on who you asked. For Dennis's family, his sister Erica, his ex-wife Rachel, his now grown grandson Owen, it didn't bring relief. It brought weight. Answers are not the same thing as peace. They stood quietly at the marina the following morning as the Coast Guard lowered a new memorial plaque into the stone wall beside Dock 12. It read, Dennis Maynard, 1972, 2014, fisherman, loved, silenced, found. Carl Rivenhall's sentencing came 3 weeks later, 17 years, no chance of parole. The courtroom was quiet, half empty. Carl said nothing. He didn't look at Erica. He didn't apologize. When asked if he wanted to speak, he just shook his head and stared at the floor. The judge noted his lack of remorse, but acknowledged the guilty plea as a factor in avoiding a lengthy trial. But for those who had waited nearly a decade to hear the truth spoken aloud, the silence still stung. What stood out most wasn't just what Carl had done, but how close he had come to getting away with it. If not for a letter mailed from Astoria, if not for a sonar anomaly logged by a technician who wasn't even part of law enforcement, if not for a retired marina clerk who still kept pencil notes in a worn notebook. The case had been a puzzle scattered by time and tide. It had taken nearly 10 years for each piece to be nudged into place. And yet, even with the truth exposed, some questions would never be fully answered. Was Dennis conscious when the Lark began to sink? Did he hear the engine of Orion accelerating behind him in the dark? Did he reach for the radio, only to find the cable already cut? Those were details Carl never gave. Maybe because he didn't know, maybe because he did, and couldn't bear to say it out loud. Either way, the silence of that night still echoed, just now with a shape and a name. The wreck of the Lark was left undisturbed. No salvage effort was made to raise it. NOAA officials declared the site an underwater memorial. Coordinates were entered into the maritime registry with a single line. Vessel resting, case resolved, remains recovered. It would never appear on a tourist map or a fishing chart, but for those who needed to know, it was there. Erica returned to the site once, just once. She stood on a private boat with her grandson, now in his 20s, and looked down at the water where the final pieces of her brother's life had settled. The ocean was calm that day. Sunlight sparked across the surface. No storms, no folklore, no ghosts. Just a family finally allowed to grieve with something solid to hold on to. Dennis Maynard's story didn't end in mystery. It ended in truth. A painful, ordinary kind of truth, one driven not by monsters or myths, but by greed, fear, and a desperate man's decision to silence a witness rather than face consequence. But the ocean, for all its silence, hadn't kept the secret forever. In the end, it had returned what mattered, not just bones, but clarity, answers, the last missing piece. And for the town of Newport, the sea was quiet again, not empty, just finally at rest.